Good afternoon, everybody. With me, I have three esteemed colleagues, and in interest of time, I'm going to go right into it and allow them to introduce themselves during the session. Really, this whole concept is to talk about the interoperability between the Internet of Things and 5G and cybersecurity as a concept. It's a wide topic. We could probably spend 45 minutes on any one question, so we'll try and get through everything that we can. The first question that I have for the panel, and I'll start with Lance and work my way down, is everything from a mobile network operator to an app device or supplier to an end consumer is really the Internet of Things and the concept of security and trust. Is that something that should be built into the basic tenet? Is that table stakes, if you will? Or is that an opportunity for monetization or differentiation between suppliers?
Sure. So I'm Lance Crosby. I'm the founder and CEO of StackPath, which is an edge compute platform with services. Former CEO and founder of SoftLayer that was sold to IBM for their cloud platform. And being in cloud and edge now for 15 years, which seems unbelievable, we saw the need for security and for localization of content because in the cloud world, everything had been cloudified for lack of a better term, except for security. We saw security firms just sort of jamming their software into the cloud and calling it cloud, and it was just typically cloud hosting. And so we felt like we had to get closer to the eyeballs, hence the edge, and then enable the edge to have all the fundamental requirements. So instead of kind of creating something and then bolting on security, that when they created something, security was built into the service or solution.
Hi, I'm Peter Coffey with Salesforce, 13th anniversary with the company tomorrow, so you can guess there have been some changes during that time. I think it may be useful to say this is not so much a question of are we now adding security as have we finally eliminated the excuses for not having it. This is more like, tell me again why you can't do this. It is no longer a case of adding the security after you've got the system ready to deploy, which I've compared to building a house with bare metal wires and adding the insulation when someone buys it. It will not be done well, and it will cost more, and it will work worse. Security as a native attribute of the services. James Staten talked today about how your product is really the API you expose and the questions that it answers and the actions that it takes. And security as a native attribute of that, I think, is absolutely essential. It used to be the knowledge you had of your product ended at the moment it went into the customer's hand, or the knowledge of the service you performed ended at the moment of execution. And now you have no excuse for not being aware of and engaged in the outcome, even if it happens in a different place and at some subsequent time. And the nature of that relationship involves a collection and custodianship of a kind of data that is so much more sensitive than the old transactional data that it is possible to differentiate by talking about it the same way Volvo and Subaru used to be the only ones who talked about how safe their cars were. But now pretty much everyone talks about that, and not talking about that is suspect.
Yeah,
that's a good answer.
I completely agree. Yeah, and I'm Scott Shackelford. I chair the cybersecurity program at Indiana University, and I'm the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop, which is a center of governance research. And we have a whole working group on IoT governance, so we think about questions like this all the time. From my vantage point, especially given my kind of legal background, I see us moving into a world pretty quickly where especially baseline cybersecurity standards are not only baked in, but they have to be by dint of regulations popping up all around the world. You might be familiar with Ohio's new safe harbor provision, right? So if an IoT, for example, manufacturer uses the NIST cybersecurity framework and is breached, well, there you go. That liability can be shielded. As of this month in California, there's a new reasonableness standard for IoT manufacturers. France has gone so far that they've extended products liability to IoT manufacturers. So it's a strict liability system now. So I think, like it or not, we're rapidly heading into that world, at least requiring those baseline standards.
I think one of the aspects of your question is the regulatory standard and mandate rising quickly enough that merely being in compliance will soon be satisfactory? Today, I think we can agree in general it's not, and that being good enough means being way more than being, meeting the minimum regulatory requirement, especially in different jurisdictions. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I'm generally not a fan of regulators trying to regulate what they don't understand. And since nobody really understands this, the regulators are even worse.
I don't disagree. So at best, it's a work in progress.
Very, well, completely. GDPR is a perfect example. People who know it far better than I say it's not algebraically possible to be in complete compliance with it. There's too many things that are, at least vaguely or maybe even substantially in conflict with each other. So finding your posture, finding the position you want to take in the marketplace and with your regulators and stakeholders, that's a leadership challenge.
I agree. Which ties to the next question, ultimately along those lines, and I'll start with Lance again. How do you see the shift in workforce skill set in this new environment? Everything, you had a lot of siloed environments when you talk about the infrastructure and communication technology. You talk about software development cycles, and you see those combining, and even legal and regulatory. How do you see the general corporate workforce needing to shift to this new environment?
Yeah, well, in a perfect scenario, if we do this right, the typical worker won't know this exists because they shouldn't have to think about, do I launch this VPN? Do I do this to connect to my corporate network and do all these things that you've had to do historically? And because if you look at, the fundamental bandwidth of the internet is changing. It's been around, we can argue about forever, but 30 years, commercially back to about 1990. CompuServe and Prodigy days, and it's risen from a machine to an eyeball over the last several years much faster than anybody predicts. Cisco, Juniper, Gartner, whoever, because nobody would have any credibility if they had predicted that there were going to be cable pullers and OTT over the top as fast as it's happening. But the one thing that's happening at the same time is machine to machine, where there are no humans involved. And that level of traffic will surpass machine to eyeballs in the next 2 to 4 years. And how do we make sure that is protected? Because there won't be anyone in between to know when something's wrong or guess something's wrong or to be phished or whatever the security problem is. And as that explodes, because IoT is absolutely, getting out of control. I use the personal example. I just built a brand new home. It has 1,200 IoT devices inside of it.
And you counted them all.
1,200.
That's a lot of software updates.
Yeah. And down to every
Or maybe it's not enough.
Well, every can light has its own IP address, every doorknob, every lock, every window. And my builder thought I was insane 2 years ago, and now he's starting to build other homes that have 200, 300, 400, 500 IoT devices. When if you backed up 4 years ago, it would have been 10. And
so when Sarah this morning talked about the vast attack surface, she just meant your house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's getting out of control, and I'm in a unique position because I sort of think I know what I'm doing, or hope I know what I'm doing, but the typical consumer doesn't. But when you see billions and billions and billions of consumer products being connected to the internet, billions and billions and billions of manufacturing and industrial products being connected to the internet, you throw 5G in on top of that to where we begin to say, hey, do we connect to a router that connects to 5G, or do we just connect the device to 5G?
Yeah.
And then it becomes the wild, wild west of how do we control this? How do we create parameters? How do we create,
Well, 10 years ago, I could point out to customers that they had silos, and they would react with cautious consideration, say, oh yeah, maybe we do. Now they arrive saying, we have to get our silos consolidated so we have a unified view of the customer, because now the data coming off of the experience the customer is having is going to inform product design. It's going to inform proactive maintenance, which is generally speaking cheaper than reactive break-fix maintenance. There are so many reasons now why this data needs to be, and Dean the other day used the word capillary, capillary locations, like the circulatory system where every little blood vessel gets out there. It's just got to be out there bringing the data in and making it available for all the reasons that you need to improve your engagement with your customer.
So going back to my question, and the changes that you've seen at Salesforce from then to now, and if you look forward in the future, how do you see that as it applies to an employee or a product manager or a marketer or a legal team? And how do you see that change?
There's no longer that months or years long waterfall from surveys to requirements to design to focus group to deployment. It's a much more organic, continuous process now. You look at the kind of cycle that you see in application life cycles on the phones compared to what it used to be. It took 30 years for PCs to go from 10% to 90% of households, 8 years for smartphones, less than 2 years for wearable tech. These cycles are contracting as we speak. And so a continuous process is not a batch process running faster. It's a qualitatively different process, and it requires a different organization mentality and culture.
And Scott, you're the professor in the group. How do you see the mind shift changing?
Well, absolutely. We structured the cybersecurity program at my university kind of with this question in mind. So we brought together our business school, our law school, and our computer science department to expose students to the technical, legal, and business dimensions of cybersecurity risk management. So I think, breaking down those silos, building bridges is really critical. So you have a more well-rounded, well-versed professional that can understand the privacy and security implications of rolling out these new devices, including how it impacts the broader ecosystem. Right?
So follow up into the next question, when we talk about the ecosystem in general, are there areas where a product or service is at the most risk of being caught in a reactive rather than a proactive manner, from your view, Scott?
I think so. We actually did a little project, actually looking at some telecoms in particular and how they're using the NIST cybersecurity framework and tailoring it in different ways. When you look across, a couple different sectors, there are some laggards for sure. So we compared, for example, healthcare to telecom in this particular study and found that in general, telecom was a bit more robust along some of the metrics looking at the NIST framework that we looked at. But there's a lot of other arenas too. Right? No, well done. That's great. Where we still see a reactive mindset despite, cyber fatigue almost sitting in at this stage. So I think we still need to do a lot more to, frankly, not only talk about the need for better cybersecurity, but then quickly follow up with some really basic steps that companies can take about, how to actually manage this. I'll just note that the NIST privacy framework just came out in the last week, so hopefully that's going to be as influential as the cybersecurity framework was in kind of building out this conversation.
My current favorite example is the shock and horror of the Allied forces in the Iraq and Afghanistan area. They discovered that a black site that was not supposed to be on any map that wasn't classified was accurately identified on the public website of a certain fitness wearables company because the soldiers were wearing their devices. And so we not only knew where the site was, we knew when they did their workouts and when they were all in the mess hall. And it hadn't been anticipated. It's what I call a shockwave scenario. The first thing you hear is the breaking glass, and then you hear the passing plane. The data was out there, and there was no proactive, oh yeah, wearable fitness devices should not be brought onto the base. They haven't managed to get a military pamphlet on that yet. So trying to keep up with this is really difficult to do.
It's akin to the new wave, or the old wave of disasters in the 19th and early 20th century, where we learned from hurricanes and earthquakes and tidal waves and whatnot, and early warning systems to those.
Well, it's also exactly what happened with spreadsheets in the late 1980s, when suddenly all sorts of data that was formulaic data, that was intellectual property, was being mailed around like email attachments. In fact, still is. The European Spreadsheet Risks Interest Group has a wonderful archive of spreadsheet horror stories. And this is just like spreadsheets, only you wear them and they're with you all the time.
And then Lance, you've dealt with everything from data centers and cloud infrastructure and edge infrastructure. What's the area that you see in interaction with the enterprise?
Yeah, the challenge is we're going, when you talk about preactive versus proactive, is cloud taught us to shift from, hey, my data is in this data center in Dallas, Texas, or wherever, to, hey, it's in an East Coast zone, it's in a West Coast zone, and I need to think of this as a geographic type distribution of our data or our workloads. And the edge is going to take that even farther, and it's going to become intent-based workloads, where you're not going to be selecting where you want to be in the world. You're going to say, in North America, I want my customers to experience 10 milliseconds or less with this amount of bandwidth.
You'll pay for an outcome.
Yeah. And the end purchaser, consumer of the services, will have no idea or little idea on how many nodes or how many edge it's being distributed to, because that'll be our job, is to figure out, where do we need to be to fulfill your requirements of 10 milliseconds from every eyeball that you have in North America. And if you conceptually don't have a security framework set up on how to overlay on top of that type of system, then you're already in trouble, because that's where it's going. And we're going to get there in the next 12 to 24 months. Cloud, it's like I use the iPhone as an example. In 2007, if somebody would have handed you a phone with no button and no keyboard, we would have slapped it like a bunch of monkeys running around going, what do I do with this? But they took us on a journey And it's the same thing from going to a wholly owned data center or co-location data center through the cloud and now to the edge. Things are changing, and you're no longer picking exactly where the workloads go. You're picking, what is the intent of the workloads? How fast do I want them to be delivered? And what's the bandwidth required and lowest jitter and everything else? And then you may or may not know at any point in time where it is, and it may be spinning up and down every few minutes, every few hours, every few days. You have no clue, nor should you care.
In one of William Gibson's novels, one of his characters says about a company, they're not multinational, they're post-geographic. And and this is the same author, of course, who coined the word cyberspace. Right. It's generally agreed. So he's pretty good at coming up with these phrases. And the idea of post-geographic way of thinking about this, it raises a lot of interesting questions. If you're a national government and you think phrases like data sovereignty still mean something, or you want to charge tolls for data crossing your boundary. These are, who was it this morning was referring to the problem of legacy taxation being one of the issues that, how do you get governments away from that teat of that free money they used to be able to collect just because bits were crossing a boundary?
So along those lines, and this go a little bit into what you currently do in your organization. Spend just a couple minutes to elaborate on how you see your role in this new and work in progress defined ecosystem.
Yeah, for us, we're the enabler, right? I'm creating a platform that's global in nature with literally, it's kind of reverse cloud. Instead of having 20 data centers and 12 zones, we're literally going to have hundreds of thousands or millions of machines at the edge throughout the world. It could be in your building, at the school, at the corner, who knows. And my job is to make it API driven, to give you the tool sets to create whatever security frameworks that you need to create for your type of business. And it's difficult sitting in my chair because I've been in this world a long time. So we have everything from making new startups happy by having everything is delivered as a microservice to more of the legacy or traditional enterprise who service chain and do things like that between different types of applications. And so I have to be sort of everything to everyone and enable them to do that at the edge, because there's going to be a significant disadvantage for those companies that don't get out there, because they're going to be lapped by those that do, because at the end of the day, the one thing that matters is the end user experience. They don't care about anything else. If I have to wait 1 extra millisecond for that click to change the screen or do whatever I want to do, I will use another application.
At Salesforce, especially when I'm here, I'm routinely asked, what are you doing in this conversation? You guys aren't a telco. You don't sell connectivity. And I say the difference is, unlike telcos, we know we don't sell connectivity. Telcos think they're still, in many cases, think they sell a connection as opposed to selling an outcome, selling military readiness, disaster readiness, education, entertainment. That's the outcome that's being sold. Someone at the satellite luncheon said yesterday, don't try to get me into a religious war between LEO and GEO. What we sell are systems that solve a problem, and we consume LEO and GEO. We don't sell them. And the same, I think, needs to be seen for all of us. We consume these resources to enable, as you said, the outcome that's being delivered. And our role is to get our customers, in many cases, to free themselves from the shackles of thinking the object they deliver is their product, and understand that the user experience, to your point, is the only thing that anyone's actually willing to pay to get.
Yeah. At IU on the teaching side, I think one of my goals is just to turn out with a lot of these universities well-rounded cybersecurity professionals, as I said. And to
do
that
any of
end,
those exist yet? Do we have? Is there an existence proof on that yet?
I know, right? Well, now we have 80 students that are graduating in the next 2 years. So if there's internship opportunities, let me know. I'd be happy to make a connection there. But no, we're in desperate need of a lot more of them, frankly, which is why I took it upon myself to help create the program. On the 2 things on that. One is we're also looking for lots of capstone projects. We do a lot of capstone projects for real-world clients as part of that program. And we also, just this month, launched a new cybersecurity clinic where we help especially under-resourced stakeholders across the Midwest. So a lot of local governments that are worried about, hey, what do I do about ransomware, cyber risk insurance, that kind of stuff. But we do a lot of projects for more sophisticated clients too. So would love to let me know if you're interested in participating in one of those. On the research side, Lynn Ostrom had this famous quote that trust is the most important resource, and a lot of the work that we do at the Ostrom Workshop is, believe it or not, building trust in distributed systems. Whether that's dealing with issues like climate change, how do you get lots of different groups at lots of different levels to work well together and help solve this global collective action problem? We're trying to apply some of those same insights now to these hot topics in cybersecurity and internet governance, including on the IoT side. So I think those insights and how you design systems and institutions that are responsive is really, frankly, instrumental. And we work a lot with different industries toward that end. So let me know if you're interested in that too.
I didn't mean to be facetious when I said, are there any well-rounded security professionals? Because you could argue that security is a technology, trust is a behavior, and engagement is the outcome.
That's it.
And ultimately, engagement is the only thing you're going to get paid to achieve. So security has to be viewed as I think the phrase you used early in the conversation is table stakes. Being prepared to talk about it in a way that generates trust is a marketing act, if you will. Apple, for example, has made it very clear they're going to talk about their role in protecting your privacy as a marketing statement. Whether their technology is actually different, that's an argument between Apple and the FBI at the moment.
I don't disagree. That the thing that I've observed in my tenure, of multiple decades in this or other businesses is ultimately cybersecurity in any role was a table stakes or minimum compliancy checkbox. Now it's becoming a product, and it's a trust-driven product. To your point with the Apple marketing. Last question, since we are running short on time. This is slightly provocative and pure opinion, but
as opposed to what you've been doing so far.
Yeah, so far. This is vanilla. Do you see, in your opinion, I'll start with Lance, will regulation or additional oversight help or hinder this process? And I'm not talking necessarily US-based or even international-based regulation. Just in general, what's your thoughts on help or hindrance with this process?
I hope and pray that the regulators stay away from the internet as much as humanly possible, because every time they intend to do good, it has negative effects to the outcome itself. Perfect example of one that happened to us. We were working with a big retailer this past Christmas, doing facial recognition in the stores, required heavy computational work very close to the stores. The city of San Francisco passed a regulation, you can't do facial recognition. Yes, the city that created it passed a law that says you can't do it without an exact opt-in. And so, on the fly, in the middle of the season, we had to build a wall around the city of San Francisco so that we didn't violate those laws. And you throw in GDPR and Canadian regulations and all and every time one of them comes up, the intent is good. The outcome is cumbersome and can be, explode in your face. And I think as long as we, as good netizens, have good practices and do things that are in the best interest of the internet going forward, then not every country, every state, every city in the world will pass a regulation, because if they do, we're going to cripple the internet and it will become, a lot less valuable than it is today.
Peter?
Well, at Salesforce, we've created an Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology. It's run by a professional ethicist who is materially involved in technology and product delivery decisions. We think that that's ultimately going to be much better in terms of outcome for our customers and therefore for ourselves than waiting to be dragged out of the foxhole and put in front of the lights in a Senate hearing. And I am dismayed to see how many companies are making government drag them out into the lights, because the result of that interaction is going to be what you've described: poorly crafted regulation that criminalizes routine and necessary behaviors and ultimately harms customers. So that's not a good thing. The most provocative piece of legislation I see out there right now is in the Senate in the US right now. It's a thing called the Algorithmic Accountability Act. It's going to require companies to do a decision system impact assessment, like an environmental impact assessment. It talks about what data are you collecting, how long will you keep it, what rights will people have to see what you've collected about them, what rights will they have to correct it. And this is what happens when you wait for the regulators to come for you. And I think we all need to be much more proactive about that, so that the posture is one of we're working to protect our customers' interests and not one that hides in the foxhole and waits to be pulled out of it.
Scott, last 20 seconds.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Bruce Schneier has a good quote that the choice isn't between regulation or no regulation for IoT, it's between smart regulation and stupid regulation,
Hear, hear.
right?
Yeah.
And Bruce is actually giving a talk at IU this next week, the Ostrom Memorial Lecture, so beam that, it's going to be really good. But just in brief, smart IoT trust marks, I'd like to see a lot more of that kind of thing. And frankly, a lot more in the realm of disclosure and reasonableness, whether we like it or not, I think is coming.
Awesome. With that, I want to thank you, everybody. Lance, Peter, Scott.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you.